If you've got a Bible, have it open at Mark chapter 12. Let's pray as we begin. Father, as we come to your word now, your living and active word, the book like no other, through your Spirit, open our eyes and ears to hear every challenge and every comfort, and most of all, to see the glory of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, I love words. I absolutely love words, and I always think it's fun to learn a new one. So I've got a word for you this morning. Who knows this word? There's the odd person who does. Well, there's Vinny. That was predictable. But this word is pronounced Fugazi. And it's not that surprising that you don't know it. This isn't some piece of Greek. I'm not doing that. This is a piece of New York mafia slang. And it means fake. Apparently it's been around for decades. And you can use it of people to describe someone you don't like, who you think is hollow. And you can use it of counterfeit goods. And I first heard it in an Al Pacino film where he's playing a mobster who's been given a diamond ring to settle a debt. And he's chuffed to bits with it because he's been told he's got a Tiffany diamond worth in today's money north of $40,000. And he's very, very pleased until the moment where he takes it to a jewel appraiser. And he's sat there, and because it's a mafia film, he meets the appraiser in a bar, and the guy says to him, "This is very nice, you should give it to your wife." And he goes, "Why should I give it to my wife?" And the guy goes, "It's a Fugazi. It's a fake." And at that point, Al Pacino isn't very happy, and needless to say, about 5 minutes later in the film, the guy that gave it to him is really not very happy at all either. Now, I start there because this passage today is about the real and the fake. Things that look good on the outside, but inside are hollow. A convincing fake, much like that diamond ring, is still a fake. And what appears to be value, what presents as valuable, is in fact worse than worthless. And this passage is about people, and whether they're true and whether they're fakes, and it's about the one who will ultimately appraise each of us. And it's pretty straightforward to work. It falls into two clear parts. You'll have noticed that as we read it. And its center is this basic contrast between the fakes, to use that word, the fugazis of faith, and the real deal. And in both cases, it's people who are vulnerable and went unnoticed who are lifted up, and those who are esteemed who prove to be fakes and brought low. At this time, widows were extremely vulnerable and at real risk of poverty. And in the first vignette, they're the victims that God sees and takes up arms for, and in the second, she's a hero. So the first half is the fake, the knockoff, and the sham, verses 38 through 40. Now, if you've not been with us the last few weeks, I'm going to catch you up with where we are. We're in Mark's Gospel, his record of the life of Jesus, where his aim in writing, what he's setting out for us, is who Jesus is, what Jesus did, and why that matters for all of us, and so how we should respond. And where we are in the story is Easter week, the very first Easter. So Friday of the week when all this happened, that's Good Friday, when Jesus is crucified, and the Sunday is the first Easter Sunday, and we're probably at Tuesday. And we've been seeing over the past few Sundays, Jesus condemned, declared unfit for purpose the temple, and with it, the whole leadership of ancient Israel as a whole. They've not been leading as they should, and he spelt that out in the parable of the talents, where we were a few weeks back. They were supposed to serve God as his tenants, but they made a land grab and tried to take everything for themselves. They considered it, in fact, like the mafia, their thing. So when Jesus came, they didn't welcome him. They weren't interested in their own Messiah because they didn't want anyone shaking things up, taking their power and their privilege away. And last Sunday, we saw Jesus going around, in essence, serving eviction notice on all the current tenants. He works through them, you may have noticed, group by group by group, dismissing them all. They try and catch him out. They prove they're unfit to lead Israel by their actions and their ignorance. And all the major groups are represented: the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, and the scribes, the teachers of the law. And that last group, the scribes, are still very much in Jesus' sights where we are today. Now, on previous weeks, we've emphasized, haven't we, when we come to this, what we don't want to do is to just look down on the villains of the piece from the great moral high ground of 2,000 years on. Weren't they awful men? This isn't here so we can feel good about ourselves by not being them. The dangers they posed, the dangers that drew their hearts away from God, in fact made them run from him, all of that is alive and well and will be familiar to us. And when we think this through, it's got to be important because we know the cross is in plain sight at the end of the week. We know what happens on Good Friday. Jesus knows what's coming. And this is what he taught his disciples about. This, you'll notice, is what he calls them to him and says, get this, guys. Because he knows that they and we need to know that following Jesus is not a matter of going through the motions, it is a matter of the heart. Because the Bible is clear that our actions flow downstream from our hearts. And that's exactly what we see going on here. The right actions without the right hearts doesn't work. Exactly what Tom was actually saying about the baptism. You don't love Jesus, baptism doesn't mean a thing. So verse 38, as he taught, Jesus said, watch out, be on your guard. Here is a clear and present danger. Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogue and the place of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. And there's a three-part condemnation there of what these guys love. I'll break it down. Number one, they love attention. They love attention. They like to walk around in flowing robes. They love to be seen. They love the distinctive clothes they get to wear because it flags up their status in society. Everyone knows what they do when they see them. You know, you're out and about in Jerusalem doing your shopping, meeting someone for coffee, sorting out your car. You see a scribe, you know exactly who he is, and they get respect. It's part of the package. They like to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, meaning more than they like people to say hello. Everyone likes it when someone bumps into them and says hello. We all like that. That's got nothing to do with actual connection and friendship. They like the status of someone going, oh, that's you. That's what you do. It makes them feel more important than other people. They're the ones that get the greetings. They're the ones that people know. These are minor, it seems unbelievable to us, but they were minor celebrities in ancient Jerusalem. And they love to be greeted. Think of people, if you want a modern equivalent, they like it when people come up and want a selfie. That's what they loved. With their profile, with their views of the law, they were the influencers of the day. And that's what mattered to them. Now, like for like, I don't think there's an equivalent of the scribe actually in our society today, but their attitude and what drove them, that's alive and well, and we see it all the time. People who want to be seen, and they want to be seen as being more than others. The person who, because of what they do, thinks they count more than other people. Oh, I mean, you know, you can imagine they'd be thinking anyone could work in the market, anyone can do that job, anyone can work on a shop, anyone can work on the buses, but me, I do what few can. Very few people could do my job, and that makes me better. That's the tune their hearts play. And they'd have walked into their local coffee shop and they'd loved the fact that they went in and they could just order the usual because people knew what it was. But the fact is they would never have bothered to learn the name of the person that served it to them. Of course, what makes it so bad here is that their job was they were supposed to be the ones who pointed people to God. But even when they did, they didn't really mean it. What they wanted to point people to was themselves. It's very, very far cry from what Jesus himself said. We were here a while ago, Mark 10:43. Whoever wants to become great among you must, non-negotiable, no other way. You must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. No one beneath you. No one. These guys, they love the attention. And second, they love privilege. They love it. They love to have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. Top table everywhere for them. You know, you're planning a wedding back then. You're doing your seating plan. It's a total nightmare if you've ever done it. Try not to offend people, working out who can sit together. Top of your list is, well, we've got some scribes coming. We need to sit them near the front. That's where they belong. That's where they belong. In the synagogues, it's not front row seats for them. It's actually special seats at the front so everyone could see them and how important they were and admire them. I mean, they take God so seriously and they're full of learning. Basically, wherever they got the VIP treatment, important seats, places of honor. Everything that said, you matter more. Upgrades on your flights, comp tickets to see Adele, the bill waived in your restaurants of choice. Privilege because you are someone. Now, last summer, I met an old friend of mine for breakfast in central London. And I arrived before him, and I went into this place, and the staff were like, table for how many? It was like table for two, and they sat me on this table that was kind of the middle of everything, and it was busy all around me, and that was absolutely fine. I just sat there and I was waiting. When my friend arrived, they recognized him. And we got moved immediately to a much nicer table and a much quieter one. Now, even though that was nothing to do with me, I mean, they had literally looked at me and gone, that'll do for him. Even though it was nothing to do with me, it felt so good to be moved. It felt so good to be moved. I liked it, even if it was just someone else's reflection. And yet, we know and we confess that Jesus had all the glory and all the worth, and how was he treated? See, things like that, you see them in you. It's easy. I find it very easy to look down on these scribes. The things that had hold of their hearts are alive in here. And if you pursue them, if your love goes for them, you'll end up on the same road as these boys. They loved privilege. And third, they loved money. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Now, devouring widows' houses, I'm not entirely sure how they did that, but apparently scribes weren't paid. They had to raise their own support, so they functioned like interns or something. And I guess, therefore, they were always on the lookout for benefactors. And who would be a better benefactor than a widow you could convince to support your ministry because you're so important? Could be foisting yourself on them, getting hospitality, or pressing them into giving gifts they couldn't afford. After all, it's the Lord's work you're doing. I mean, Jesus is pretty clear. This is extensive, isn't it? They devour widows' houses. They pressed it home. They bled them dry, all in God's name. They were scammers who keep coming back for more, mercilessly playing on someone's good nature, that nature that keeps them from seeing or believing what's been done for them. And they leverage it. Now, interestingly, there's some debate actually as to whether the scribes were wealthy or not. It's hard to say. Because you don't need any money to be greedy, do you? Money is an idol in the heart of the rich and the poor alike. All you have to do is live for it and put your hope in it. And that happens with people who have it and with people that don't. Now, interestingly, when these come up, if you look at the verses again, attention, privilege, and money, they're all framed as pairs, but this one doesn't kind of seem to match up. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. Robes fits with respect, seats in the synagogue, seats at the feast. But then fleecing people is coupled with prayer. Now, how does that fit? I think what Jesus is saying is they cover their money-grabbing antics with great shows of piety. Their extensive knowledge of the scriptures, of liturgy and psalms. They could string together spontaneously great, long, impressive prayers, and it was all a cover for a sick, rotten heart. Now, given the crowd loved hearing them get an absolute battering from Jesus in the previous bit, you'll see that. It says they were delighted to hear Jesus beating them up theologically. I imagine some of that hypocrisy was seen, but I also imagine people overlooked it because of their great spiritual insight. No one's perfect, and they really do know their Bibles. And look at the way they're dressed. They are part of something. And because they were venerated as people, people didn't want to see what was going on. It is posh veneer on wooden chipboard. And I guess it would say, people would say things like, well, we've heard him pray. And when he teaches, he's quite brilliant. So I'm sure he's got Mrs. Soon-to-be a very poor widow's best interests at heart. When in fact, he had her money at his heart and then in his bank account. Scammers and con men. And it's not just one or two, is it? Jesus doesn't confront someone in particular. It must have been endemic for what Jesus says, because he doesn't call out one scribe, he calls out them all. Farming widows for cash was clearly the trick you were taught. You know, you turned up at scribe school and you said, well, how's this going to work? How do we get any money? And the answer was this: you need to find yourself a good, wealthy widow. Not that one. I've already bagged her. Find one of your own. It's like working in a dodgy call center and being told how to get hold of someone's bank details. And these are the people who are supposed to be helping God's people to understand the Bible better. You want to see a good scribe? Look at Ezra. That's what he did. And what's the verdict? Verse 40, these men will be punished most severely. Those are terrifying words to hear from Jesus, and he meant them. They will be condemned. They will get away with absolutely nothing, because the all-seeing eye of Jesus, the one who we'll see next week, will return to judge all. His eye catches it all. See, to gain the accolades of people, to enjoy that respect, to be, as some of these guys were probably, the pride and joy of their mum, and end condemned by God is the worst deal you could make. Nothing suggests that earthly justice caught up with these clowns. In this life, they were untouchable. They carried on after this, getting the attention, the privilege, the money. But one day, they would answer to the God they had fraudulently misrepresented, and they would pay in full. Now, with this and what we've seen in previous weeks, I imagine it becomes clear why Jesus is saying the current tenants of the kingdom had to go. Those who formerly held authority, he was showing them the door. But that doesn't mean it isn't relevant to us today, because the call is still to serve Jesus with all our hearts, minds, and souls. It is still to be the servant of all. That hasn't changed. If you can think of someone in this room, someone you know, who you think, actually, you know what? I am more important than them. They can't do what I do, and I wouldn't feel the need to help. Someone else could help. They might need help, but that's not a job for me. I'm too important for that. You've lost it. You've lost it. These are not just the first generation of Christians. They're for all of us. And the sad truth is that most of us will have had the experience of either being hurt by or seeing the fallout of ministries and leaders who looked great and turned out to be a facade. And I don't even mean the prosperity guys. I know they're all captured by this. But men and women who looked like the real deal, who wrote the books we read, who headlined the conferences we went to, who made videos and podcasts that we all said were helpful, and then one day they were exposed. This is not a first century problem. This week I spoke at the CU, and there was a Q&A time afterwards. The questions are submitted anonymously online. I've got a copy of them here. Two of them were this: what happens to individuals who claim to have a relationship with Jesus but commit immoral or evil acts? And a second question had this added to it. And so why do we have such high standards for church leaders nowadays? Now, why are people asking those questions? It's because of what they've seen of people who claim to follow Jesus. Why does that matter? Because on Thursday night when I spoke, they listened to me, but they looked at them, and they didn't like what they saw. Because the message and the messenger are supposed to line up, and it causes enormous harm to the gospel when they don't. Because people see the messenger as a phony, so what do they conclude about the message? It's why Jesus comes down ton of bricks fashion here, doesn't he? And whilst we may not all occupy the public space, we're all supposed to authenticate the gospel with the way we live. Not perfectly. As Adam said, we don't do that. But we are to do it sincerely, with repentance and faith and being done with sin. I've got a friend, a really great guy, who struggles with faith because his dad was a churchman. And he tells me the contrast between who his dad was on a Sunday when he was in the pulpit was completely different. And there was a vast chasm to who he was the whole rest of the week. And he tells me he saw that for as long as he can remember from his childhood, the pretense of it all. And of course, on one day, it all imploded. Jesus warns of and implicitly tells us not to be a fake, a knockoff, a sham. But thankfully, we don't finish there, because we come to another unnamed hero of Mark's story. There's a number of them. Last week it was a scribe. This week it's a widow, who is part two, the genuine, the authentic, the real deal. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple's treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. Now, we need to get this. The point here is not that they're being particularly ostentatious. I know it says through, like we imagine them kind of, like Scrooge McDuck with a massive bag of gold, and they kind of toss it in like that. No, the word is actually the same one as that's used of what the widow did. That isn't the point here. If they'd been truly generous, it would have made even more noise. That's not what this is about. Rather, the point is Jesus doesn't care less, absolutely could not care less about the externals, what other people see. He is always, always, always looking at your heart. There's no fooling him, not even for a second. That's who Jesus is. He is the one to whom all hearts are open and no secrets are hidden. The rich, the widow, the scribes, their hearts were an open book to Jesus, and yours and mine are too. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few pence. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into this treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Now, just as an aside, I think this is another one of those bits which it just shows us the glory of who Jesus really is. I love these details scattered through the Gospels that show he's totally man, totally God. He sits down. Now, that's an incidental detail. I sit down as often as possible. But remember, this is God in the flesh. He sits down and he watches and he sees deeply. And he knows. He knows for sure these rich people aren't being generous. Rich people can be generous, of course, but these ones aren't. And he knows exactly how much the widow has, and this was all of it, because he knows everything. Fully man, fully God. And what does he call his disciples to understand? I love that. He calls them over. Get this. What does he say to them, and what does he say through the centuries down to us? What does he say? Clover, Tom, Becky, Lexi, Adam, Sarah, the rest of us. What is he saying? He's saying it's all about the heart. Look, see, do you understand? And the heart is revealed not by what we give, but by what we keep. The small heart works like a shrink ray on a big gift, so it gets so small God can't see it anymore. And the opposite is true. A big heart magnifies it right up. I mean, look at the way Jesus judges it. This poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. That's his verdict. I mean, they were still rich in the end. The implication is their giving didn't touch the side of their bank accounts, their managed funds, their nest eggs, their bonuses. Sure, it sounded like a lot of money, but it didn't look like it to Jesus. The reality was, the true cost to them was minimal. Years ago, it must be like 20 years ago or something, I was watching Children in Need. And it was fairly early on into the Premier League era when footballers were, their salaries had gone through the roof. And I remember them talking about a gift that a particular footballer had given. And they told us the amount. And I can only think that he had given them permission or indeed even asked them to do such a thing. And I was just a bit suspicious of this. So I worked out, because his salary was known and had been published, I worked out how much he had given in proportion to my salary at the time. And it turned out, in proportion to our salaries, he had given the same amount as if I gave a tenner. And I would never expect to get a mention for giving tenner to children in need. But of course, what's he thinking? He's thinking about the amount that looks so big and not the true cost to him. God isn't impressed with the amount we give. God is literally impossible to impress. Never try that. But with everything we do, there's always a hidden transaction going in our hearts, the way we use our money, our resources, our time, and that shows who God really is to us. The widow had given a little financially, but she was big-hearted. She trusted it all and herself to God, and she was the real deal surrounded by very impressive fakes. And that's what Jesus wants his disciples And that's what he wants us to see. So again, what do we do with this? We've got to do more because, it's easy, isn't it? You can look down from 2,000 years. We didn't like the scribes. You think, this was a nice little old lady. Bet she was marvelous. But Jesus is surely warning his disciples against two things when he bids them come to him and listen. One is being seduced into thinking you make a show of commitment to him, particularly with your money. You can give large amounts of money to churches or charities and think you've earned favor with God because of the size of what you've given. You can drop hints to people around you about what you've done, when in fact you're still holding on to the one thing that God ever wanted from you, which was your heart. And second, I think Jesus is warning about basing our judgment of people based on their visible wealth and observable generosity. The church is not to be a place where influence can be bought, not by anyone. And if we reckon ourselves more important than others because of our resources or because we've given more, we are walking the way of the scribes and the rich here. But I also think you can flip this, because you may feel really stretched financially right now. Everything's going up in price. Everything. And Jesus knows. Jesus knows. And any giving you may do may seem so small and so insignificant, it can feel to you, well, what difference would that make? I can't give like those other people might. It can make all the difference. That's what Jesus says here, because it can please him. And if he is your delight, then his delight is your delight. And that's worth all the acclaim of men and women and then some. Now, because we're on this theme of giving, I think it's worth underlining, isn't it? We're not talking about giving to me and Tom when we talk about giving. If we were behaving like the scribes and we need sacking. What we're talking about here is giving to the work of the gospel, to fuel gospel ministry home and abroad, because we love Jesus and we want more people to know about him. See, the widow gave to the temple. The temple is now the body of Christ, his people. So we give for gospel ministry and gospel priorities, helping people like the widow, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the poor, all to the glory of Jesus. Now, you may not be able to give much at all. She couldn't. But what Jesus teaches here is that a heart in the right place magnifies that beyond all recognition in his sight. If things are tight, be encouraged by what he says here. Truly, I tell you, listen to me, he says. This is serious. You've got to get this. This poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. It's magnificent, isn't he, Jesus? Now, fundamentally, what's got wrong in both halves of the passage is the same. And I think when you tie all this together, if you look up the page to verse 28, where we were last week, where Jesus is asked, well, which of the commandments in the Bible are the most important? He says, it's the most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And all is exclusive, isn't it? That's the point. It's an exclusive love. It's not over 50%. It's not that it's the main thing, the majority. It's an all. So love for God should be squeezing out of us the love for status and money and privilege. Because a heart captured by God loves God. I'm struggling with this stuff. It's not about saying, I don't want to love money. I don't want to love money. I must try and not be noticed. No, your heart needs capturing with a better vision and a more powerful, more glorious love, a love for God and his glory. That is the way we change. And in the final biblical analysis, which is the only one that really counts, we are what we love. We are what we love. Now, if you're here today and you wouldn't say that you follow Jesus, this may be the first time you've heard much about him, I'd encourage you to there's a table on the back there with Mark's Gospels on, so you can read the rest of it. Just help yourself to one of them. They're all free. But this matters because Jesus is clear, isn't he? There is a reckoning. Verse 40. These men will be punished most severely. So yes, what these guys did will catch up with them. But so will every way that we have fallen short. We don't meet our own standards, let alone God's. Adam said that earlier. It's not what other people think about us that counts, but what God sees. And I'm sure each one of the scribes could point to each other. You know, if they were confronted, they could say, yeah, but everyone was doing it. I didn't really mean any harm. It's what I'd been trained to do. Look, nobody's perfect. Maybe I got that wrong, but look, I did do all this kind stuff too. I was great to my grandma. And all those excuses. And how much ice does that seem to cut with Jesus? Now, this is a quote that's famously attributed to Abraham Lincoln. You may well have heard it in the past. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. You see, what we need to know, isn't it, is the truth is whatever people you fool, even yourself, if you lie to yourself, you fool God none of the time. None of the time. And the situation for all of us would be hopeless were it not for what Jesus would do 3 days later. Because this happens on the very week that Jesus went to the cross to pay for every dark corner of our hearts. Think about what we saw in the baptisms. The one who sees our hearts, that sees the mess that we can hide pretty effectively from other people, and sometimes even ourselves with our excuses because we don't want to face into things. He died to make those hearts clean, to share his glory with us, so that you wouldn't need excuses that ultimately won't cut it, because better than excuses, you have a cross. See, Jesus takes all that's wrong with us and he gives us all that's right with him, and that is the deal at Calvary. Now, I'm not going to get into heaven when I see my King because I'm better than the scribes. I'll get in the only way anyone can, because I've been forgiven. Because I've been forgiven. You can't earn it. You need to be gifted it. That's what grace is. And this morning, that's what he calls. That's what he calls over to you this morning. Across the centuries, through his word, he calls you over to him. And he says, this is too much for you. That burden of which Adam spoke, you cannot take it off yourself. But give it to me. And I will carry it for you. Because that's what I do. And Jesus is the ultimate when it comes to genuine, authentic, the real deal. Listen to him. Amen.